Chapter 5 The Adventure of the Silent Horseman. I may not go farther tonight, for I am very weary. It may be that we shall find a lodging in this cottage. Now Sir Constant had seen that his comrade's strength was failing, and for the latter part of the day had watched and aided him with anxious care. Glad was he, therefore, to see the white-walled cottage by the way, and still more did he rejoice when he saw the emblem of the king's service upon the door. Great is our good fortune, and none too soon, sighed the aged Sir Valorous. Never have I felt so grievously the burden of my arms in the fatigue of the road. Do knock, dear friends, and let us see what befalls. So Sir Constant knocked, and immediately the door was opened by the master of the cottage. Humble was his dress, and stained with toil, but in his face and bearing were mingled the gentleness of kindness and the strength of courage, with hope and faith to lighten all. When he saw the knights, there was joy in his eyes, and with joy he answered them. His cottage, he said, was one of the rest houses appointed for the king's servants, and it was called the House of the Parting of the Ways. And he was a kinsman of that Master Joyous, who had given shelter to Sir Constant after his peril of the Black Knight. So right-heartedly he took them in, and relieved them of their armor, and presently set food before them, giving the tenderest care and honor to the aged Sir Valorous, for he saw that the gallant old knight was weary indeed, both with the toil of the road and the burden of his years. When they had supped, he showed them his garden, at which they marveled greatly. The cottage was set in a low and stony part of the Valley of Toil, near where the splendid way led on into the Pass of Tears. The entrance to the pass was solemn and gloomy, but still less of cheer had another path which led away among the mountains and was shortly lost in the mist and clouds. Yet even in this place had the cottager made a garden of delight by claiming from the barren rocks many a tiny plot from another man had thought unworthy of his pains. These he had filled with soil from other places, and had then sown seeds and flowers and fruit. So at last there were many tiny gardens in one, a wealth of sweetness and beauty which none could have hoped to find in such a place. And when the wind blew, it bore the perfume of the garden of Master Patient far into the Pass of Tears, and far along the narrow way which was lost in mist and shadow. When I think of the king's city, there comes ever the vision of flowers, said Sir Valorous. Here today I might believe that I taste the solace of such a garden as his. So gracious is the peace that flows into the heart from these blossoms of yours. And the cottager smiled. Then I choose to plant these, he said gravely. I think of the king's city and pray that I may find such flowers as grow in his gardens. Surely none could comfort so well the weary travelers who come to the parting of the ways. Such comfort and ease are what I wish for them, and what I seek to offer. So it may be that there is truth in your thought. Know you the end of that path among the mountains? Asked Sir Constant. It is lost in mist and cloud. I cannot surely know, said Master Patient. Of the many who have taken that path, none have returned to tell me. It is called the Valley of the Shadow, but I doubt not that it leads to the great city. Then the city is beyond those hills? Asked Sir Constant eagerly. Assuredly, said Master Patient. This I know, for the two paths lead that way. The one that is lost among the mist, and the other plainer path where the valley of toil becomes the pass of tears. But none may take the path through the mist, save the summons of the king. Then the cottager went into his house to make ready the chamber for them. But the two knights lingered a while in the garden, breathing the quiet airs of that place of rest and the perfumes of its flowers. The sun had set far away over the western lands whence they had come, but still his last beams were beacons upon the mountain tops, and touched with glory the mist which hid the path of mystery. And Sir Valorous said, while the glory of the sunset seemed to linger on his brows, surely his saying is true. While we keep in the king's service, seeking only his will, all ways shall lead to him. As for me, my brother, never have I felt the king's power and love as I do in this hour. It is the peace of the garden and the perfume of the flowers, said Sir Constant in his heart. For with the pass of tears before him, the great city seemed yet far away. But Sir Valorous then turned his thoughts to the past journey, and in the manner of old men brought fair and pleasant things out of the treasury of the yesterdays. For it was now many days since they had met at the hall of the glowing heart, and the days between had seen many battles and much fair and gracious converse. Yet in a while he spoke of days still older, of his youth, of hope, in the stalwart deeds of his prime. Not boastfully he spoke, but with reverent and grateful heart, and with fond memories of those who had companioned with him on the journey. Gently but proudly he took their names upon his lips, their praise his joy, and their valor and worth the fair jewels of his memory. And of late, he said, they have been very near to me, those old comrades, as though the years between grew faint and fainter. In my dreams I see them, and sometimes their voices reach me in the sighing of the winds, in the whisper of the trees. Yesternight they seemed to gather round me with many joyous greetings while I slept, and even now, then the old knight fell silent, gazing out over the garden to the hills, but seeing what no other might see, hearing what no other might hear. But presently he roused himself and smiled, and said that they would go to rest, for the evening grew chill. So they went into the cottage, into the chamber prepared for them. There Sir Valorous lay down, covering himself with his cloak like a warrior after battle, his armor set beside his couch, as was his custom, the brave shield over all, glorious with the emblem of the service. And so he fell asleep. But Constant could not rest, for his heart was heavy with care. He did not fear the keeper of the house, but rather some shadow of loss and pain that had its haunt in that gloomy pass, in that mist-laden valley. Moreover, the words of the old knight had chilled him, for it was as though other voices were calling his comrade from his side, and calling urgently. And he had loved the old man with a great love, first for his mighty aid in the wood of beasts, and ever after for his tender fellowship and loyalty, in the greatness of his soul. So at last he rose, and having clothed himself, sat down to watch by the sleeper. Whatever the perils of this place, they should not find the good Sir Valorous unguarded. Sir Constant sat at the foot of the sleeper's couch, where he could see faintly the form of his and face of his friend, but he would have no light lest it should break his slumber. By this time night had fallen upon the valley, starless and still, so that the casement of the chamber seemed to be curtained without by a pale of black. There was no sound save the breathing of the sleeper. For a while he sat, more and more aware of the spell of the place. It brooded over the valley and the hills and the pass. It crept like a dread mist about the cottage and enveloped it. Into the chamber also it flowed, so that he could hear his own heart beats, and the breathing of the old knight seemed loud and full of pain. So presently he found his good sword, and laid it ready at his hand. He felt that the darkness and the silence foretold the coming of a foe. So an hour passed, and ever the spell grew deeper. There was no sound from without, no breath of light of night, wind to whisper of life and hope. He and his friend were alone together, enwrapped in a ghostly stillness, and as the silence deepened, its terror deepened also, so that the sound of his own voice could have startled him more than the blast of a battle trumpet. Then he became aware of a new terror, born of silence and charged with its oppressive power. It was as though the spell clothed itself with a form and came out of the darkness of the valley of the shadow and stood before the cottage at the parting of the ways. As it came, the night held a new and terrible presence, darker than the darkness, more silent than the silence. So real was this coming that he seemed to hear what he could not hear, the faint sound of a stealthy hoof on the stones of the valley. And after that fell a deeper silence, pregnant with fear, as a sleeper seeks to shake off the spell of an evil dream. So Sir Constant sought to free himself from that thought of dread. But as the sleeper strives in vain, so he strove in vain, for still the knowledge deepened in the fear. Out of the darkness and the silence, someone had come, clothed in mystery and dread. He stood without, at the parting of the ways, regarding the cottage jealously, as though he waited but the time to enter. But when he was fully assured of this, Sir Constant braced himself. In blade he quakened, heart be strong. What foe shall bid me tremble? He said. Am I not of the royal service? And with that he drew his good sword and strode swiftly to the casement. For a time he peered vainly into the darkness, which was so deep that he could see neither hills nor stars. Then he gripped his hilt firmly and drew back a little. Slowly out of the darkness grew the vague outlines of a form, the form of a horseman, who led another horse by the bridle. He was clad from head to heel in black mail, and a dark plume hung from his helmet. He sat without sign and without sound, moving neither this way nor that. His bridle chains hung like cords of silk, and his mail gave no ring. With chilled heart, Sir Constant gazed, till he was sure of what he saw. But the certainty brought little aid, for the shadow was a token of dread which he could not challenge with sword and shield, of peril from beyond the frontier of man's knowledge. Yet even as this truth came to his heart, resolve came also, and he gripped his sword with a stronger grip. If he could not go out to challenge the stranger, he could still hold the cottage against him to the last. But he would not call Sir Valorous until need came, so that the old knight's rest might not be broken. Slow were the hours of that night watch, and full of dread, for all through the night the silent horseman sat waiting before the house, black and mighty. No rocks in the mountains moved less than he and the steed that bore him. No shadow of the night could be more silent. At times a pale star shone through the drifting clouds, but its light found no reflection in his mail. At times a stray breeze came down over the hills, but never did his black plume move, nor the flowing manes of his horses. The breeze sighed and died before it reached the sombre form, and Sir Constant sat with his drawn sword, tense and stern and watchful. But as for Sir Valorous, he slept in peace, and as he slept, he smiled often at pleasant things. His hands moved restlessly, sometimes outstretched as though in greeting, sometimes as though to grip his weapons at the sound of battle. Broken words came upon his lips and failed there. Familiar names, half uttered, lingered upon his tongue. And so it was through that long, laborious night, until it began to be the morning, and a fresh, cool breeze from the east began to stir the darkness upon the mountain tops. But before the cottage the night lingered, as though in siege, the spirit of darkness clothed in that strange and sombre horseman. And scarce had Sir Constant guessed that day was near, before the shield of Sir Valorous, which stood beside his bed. This was first to claim the smile of the morning, so that for a time the emblem of the great king gleamed with mystic glory through the darkness of the chamber. At last Sir Valorous came out of his slumber with a great and joyous cry. My king, my king, I come, I hasten, I come. And as those words rang clear, there was a movement in the darkness without, for the phantom horses pawed the earth with their silent hoofs, and seemed to champ their iron bits with a sound. Then the horseman, bending low from his saddle, peered in at the low doorway of the cottage. But Sir Valorous gazed eagerly about him. He saw nothing of those without, but was only aware of his friend sitting beside his couch. And he said, with the smile still upon his face, I heard a voice that called me, a voice low but clear. But even as I listened, it seemed to be many voices blended in one, the lost voices of beloved friends and comrades in arms, raised in glad welcome. But through all these voices came the summons of the first, and it came in these words, Lo, I am the king's messenger, the king's messenger. I am the king's messenger. Now I heard this wondering, and only half hearing for the joy of those voices. Moreover, it was hushed and subdued, as though it came through the mists of sleep. But at last I heard another voice, full of melody and royal power. Arise, it said. Why do you tarry? My messenger stands at the door. And when I heard that voice, my heart leaped, and it was then that I cried in answer, my king, I come, I come. So great was the old knight's joy in his dream that Sir Constant was grieved that he must have so sad a awakening. But then Sir Valorous saw his face, white and stern, saw also the drawn sword in his hand, and instantly the warrior spirit sprang to the alarm. "What is it?" he cried. "Is there a foe?" Sir Constant pointed to the casement. "A horse," he said, "grim and sombre, with a lead horse. He makes no sign, but I fear him greatly. What but evil can come out of the darkness?" Sir Valorous looked and saw that dread shadow among the slowly fleeing fleeing shades of night. His smile fled, but his cheeks did not pale. "Give me my arms," he said stoutly, "and don your own. It may be that the dream was but a dream." Yes, as they swiftly donned their mail, he pondered this mystery, and it seemed as though a light broke upon his face. "True that the form is sombre and fearful," he said, "yet how can he come except the great king sent him? Let us face the mystery, then, with a good heart." And as he buckled on his strong helmet, he said again, "Shrouded he is in darkness, yet it may be that this is but the darkness of our own fears, and the darkness of the mists of our journey. For surely it cannot be darkness if it come from the king." So by faithful thoughts and brave words he heartened his comrade to face that shadow at the door. When they were mailed, they left their chamber and opened the door of the house. Still was the house, for the keepers slept in peace. And when they opened the door, the cold breath of dawn met them at the threshold. There, grim among the shadows, stood the silent horseman, motionless as the rocks. But when the knights appeared, his horses struck their hooves once more upon the earth, and champed their bits, as though they wearied of waiting. And the knights saw that his mailed and visored form had a sword unsheathed in his right hand. Sir Valorous looked upon him all his terror, but his face did not blanch. He knew that the stranger waited for him only, yet bravely he stepped forward. "Who do you seek?" he said. "Is it I?" The horseman gave no answer, but seemed to gaze fixedly upon Sir Valorous through his visor bars. But the brave old knight would not be daunted by that silence. "If you are truly the king's messenger, show me your face," he cried. "In the king's name, show me your face." Again the horseman answered not a word, but seemed to beckon that he should come nearer. Sir Valorous went, and the horseman bent down and raised his visor. The knight looked up, and there shone suddenly upon his face a light, as though the sun had broken through a cloud and touched him with its splendor. Then immediately the silent horseman closed his visor, and Sir Valorous came back to his friend. But his eyes were still filled with that light. "It is the messenger," he said. "He was the voice of my dreams. Out of the darkness indeed he comes, and therefore is the darkness all about him. But I have seen his face, and I know him for the king's messenger. Farewell for a time, dear comrade of many days, for I must go with him. But grieve not that I depart, for this day I shall see the king in his beauty." Then he kissed his comrade's cheeks, and after then he sheathed his sword and mounted the lead horse beside the messenger. Silently the horses turned their heads and silently passed away from the door at the parting of the ways. Into the fleeing shadows they went, side by side, the silent horseman and the king's knight, whose battles were done. Sir Constant watched from the threshold of the door, and in a little while they were in the dolorous way that was overhung with mist and cloud. But now the sun was rising, and his early beams began to reach the winding way. Anon they played upon those mournful mists, so that their color was changed, and they were glorified. Anon they touched the two travelers, so that the sombre mail of the silent horseman suddenly glittered and glowed. Then, as the travelers vanished, those beams found the shield of old Sir Bowers, the shield splendid with the emblem of the king's love. For a moment it flashed from the mists like a signal, and then it was gone. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Galatians 6:1.